My name's Ken Christie. I'm a professor in the School of Humanitarian Studies. And the first thing that we do in these webinars is we acknowledge the territorial and traditional lands. And Royal Roads University acknowledges that the campus is located on the traditional lands of the Esquimalt and the Songhees ancestors and families who have lived here for thousands of years. This land has been part of the fabric of the life of Indigenous communities long before Hatley Castle was built, and it will long be into the future. It is with a lot of gratitude that we now learn and work here, where the past, the present, and the future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. Thank you. So the webinar today is going to focus on conflict, migration, and refugees in the Middle East and in North Africa, and is particularly concerned with looking at things like human security platforms, the local systems in which these refugees and migrants find themselves in, and the capacity to protect the vulnerable. And I'd like to give a very warm welcome to this to people to this webinar, the third and the last for this year in our series looking at conflict in society in Rojava and the Middle East and Syria in particular. So it's the final part in this series, and we look at into more acutely into the consequences of the so-called Arab Spring in the Middle East and North Africa, and the particular effects of that in terms of vulnerable populations, especially displaced peoples, externally and internally, refugees fleeing conflict, and the serious effects this has had on sending and receiving countries. So we have a very, very distinguished panel to discuss this. Coming in from Toronto, this includes Dr. Nergis Kanefi, and coming in from New Westminster, Mr. Haval Ahmad, and coming in from northeastern Syria, Mr. Sasha Hoffman, who's in a very, very different time zone, as you can imagine. And so what I'll do is I'll introduce each of these in turn just before they make their presentations. And at the end of the presentations, we will open up the discussion. I would like to thank very much Haval Ahmad for his great work and effort in putting this series together. It would have been difficult to put it together without his work and bringing in guests, etc. And I hope if you've had the chance to listen to these webinars over the past few months, you will have found them very stimulating and informative. I'd also like to thank very much Selena Kunar and Karen Sekera for their incredible work in organizing and getting the message out to everyone so we can continue this conversation, because it is a conversation and we are in a fortunate place to discuss what's going on here while so many people suffer from these conflicts in all the various ways, etc. So let's get started. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Nergis Kanefi, and I'll go briefly over the bios of the speaker, and then we will hear from them for 10 to 15 minutes, as I said. And Dr. Kanefi is an old friend of mine, actually. She's a Turkish-Canadian scholar. She's associate faculty at Royal Roads University. She is a professor at the University of Toronto, and she works in the area of public international law, comparative politics, forced migration studies, and critical human rights. Her areas of interest are memories of atrocities and injustice and the way they shape the notion of citizenship for marginalized groups, critical studies of human rights, genocide, and crimes against humanity, the relationship between nationalism and minority rights in the Balkans and the Middle East, forced migration, and debates on ethics in international law pertaining to mass political violence. Now, Dr. Kanefi has many, many amazing credentials to her name, a whole list that I couldn't possibly go through because it would take the entire webinar. But one of the most impressive in recent times is a book that she's written, and I'll just hold this book up so people can see it, called The Syrian Exodus in Context. And on the front cover, you could probably see that this is a piece of art, and Dr. Kanefi is also an amazing artist. And I'm very proud to actually own one of her artworks, which she donated uh, to me, and I still have to get it framed. So thank you very much for all the work you do, Nergis. And we'd like to start now. You're going to talk about unorthodox minorities and the Middle Eastern state. I know this is a topic you've been working on for a long time, so thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Ken. Could you possibly let me know how much time I have in terms of presenting my work?
I'll say roughly about 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes maximum. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for the very generous introduction. It's an honor to be a part of an activity that's organized by you and by Royal Roads. It's my second home as far as I'm concerned. What I want to share with our audience today is a series of works that hopefully will culminate into a new book by the end of this academic year, which is on unorthodox minorities and the Middle Eastern state. And I could perhaps title or retitle the talk as The Past is a Foreign Country. That is obviously alluding to literal work from the world of novels and poems, but it's also very apt in terms of the fate of what I named as unorthodox minorities in the Middle East. And I want to start with a vignette of what I've gone through this summer when I was presenting part of my work this summer in a workshop organized in collaboration with the German universities and Lebanese universities. They looked at the title, and the organizer came back to me and said, "What do you mean by unorthodox minorities? You know, such and such folks are orthodox." And I said, well, what I mean by unorthodox is groups that are not recognized as by established religion, and that religion could be Islam, it could be Judaism, it could be Christianity. So in that sense, they might name themselves as the Orthodox Church of such and such and such and such region, but the recognition for that church might not have come as late as 1970s or 1980s. So for a good almost 2,000 years, the adherents of that particular faith indeed stand as unorthodox in the sense that they're not recognized and therefore they're not accorded protection, neither do they feel included in the registers of any of the three Abrahamic religions in the region. So the framework within which I am building my analysis is not so much the past events that shaped the lives of these minority groups, but also the future fate of these communities. And many of them are ethno-religious communities or ethno-linguistic communities. And the region itself provides us a very versatile geography of where these minorities are located. And in general, numerically, these minorities are under 5% of the total population, although in some cases that ratio can go up to 12% or so. But in none of the circumstances that I look at do they constitute any sizable threat to the nation state within which they habitually and historically resided. And that's very important to underline, because the kinds of measures and the kind of political violence, both at the state level and the societal level, that they have been subjected to could by no means be explained by their numeric presence or the demographic characteristics of these minorities. So my analysis accords a centrality to the acts of state. And what I mean is that I am also looking at forms of state criminality. as well as everyday practices of citizens, and their perceived sense of security and safety, defining the features of belonging in the contemporary Middle Eastern state, which often targets and classifies these unorthodox minorities as outsiders at best and public enemy of the nation at worst. So when we look at recent and not so recent history of forced migration waves in the region, the observation that I would like to share with you is that all the en masse displacement movements include one or more unorthodox minorities. Now, en masse displacement movements in the Middle East are not limited to minorities or unorthodox minorities, but they're nonetheless included in each one of them across the region. And by en masse displacement, I am talking about both internal displacement and across the border displacement, which we in 21st century commonly coined the term refugee crisis. And sometimes they're called refugees, sometimes they're called migrants, sometimes they're called asylum seekers. It depends on which frame of analysis you're applying to these populations, but nonetheless, en masse displacement means and forced migration means you are leaving against your wishes for saving your life. It doesn't mean there has to be a gun that is actually targeted to your head, but there's something called the war nexus, or there's something called a structural insecurity, which then leads to the total displacement of targeted populations. So in all of these movements since 1945 and even before, we actually see that the unorthodox minorities that I will shortly speak about have been present. So it is therefore apt to suggest that there's actually an intimate relationship between establishment of statehood, maintenance of statehood of national minority, and select targeting of national identity and select targeting of minority populations in the region. Is it unique to the region only? No. I mean, in my work, which Ken knows actually from decades ago on comparative studies on nationalism, I made the assertion that these cleansing impulses have been very common in the European context, in the North American context. So there's nothing unique about the MENA state in that regard. Perhaps what's unique, though, is it continues as waves of cleansing to this day. And there are legal arrangements made so that these kinds of population movements are not only naturalized, but also finalized in the sense that there is no right of return accorded to any of these minorities who are leaving their habitual residence and who are in most cases rendered stateless. That I look at in detail in terms of the relationship between accumulation by dispossession, emergence of new classes in Middle Eastern nation states, and state-induced policies such as confiscation and naturalization of wealth and resources that belong to these communities. What is important, though, and perhaps the analogy is a rather disturbing one, but similar to, I believe, a lobster being boiled slowly while it's alive. These movements and maneuvers and strategies are slow, subtle, and long-term. And therefore, they don't create so much dust in most cases, in the sense that if it was a large-scale crisis like the Rohingya crisis, all of a sudden pouring out of Myanmar, Burma, and Bangladesh, basically crying out saying we can't handle it anymore, then it becomes an international issue. But in most cases, the cleansing of unorthodox minorities in the MENA region, as I said, is a slow, subtle, long-term, and very planned movement. And then therefore, some argue, members of these communities argue that they are actually being subjected to cultural as well as in real term genocide. Of course, in international law, the criteria for any population movement or cleansing to qualify for genocide is very difficult to satisfy, and the threshold is very high. So for criminal law purposes, it is very hard to sustain that definition. And also we're talking about, in many cases, regime change and what's called failed state syndrome, and therefore asking for accountability for these cleansing movements is quite difficult at the current juncture. But I think it's our responsibility as scholars, advocates, and witnesses to document and provide meaning to what's happening and continues to happen in this context. So who are we talking about? What countries are we talking about? The groups that I pay attention to, and I won't have time to discuss all of the details, but they reside in a whole host of countries, including Algeria, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, obviously Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Qatar, Syria, Tunisia, Turkey, and Yemen. So the main question that motivated my work is whether there is a well-defined historical trend of dispensing with unorthodox minority groups in the region to establish and maintain statehood, and whether that tendency changed in a positive or a negative direction in the current period following the events of the Arab Spring. And as Ken kindly shared, the book that I wrote on Syrian exodus in context also asks the same question, but in the specific example of the Syrian exodus. And then who has been expelled and what happens in the long run. And in the book, I argued at the time, this was questioned in terms of its wisdom, that these kinds of slow, subdued, and yet deep extinction of certain population groups actually leads to a chronic and historical instances of mass statelessness. And when I was writing the manuscript in different venues, when I made that argument, I faced opposition suggesting these are not stateless people. They can go back. There's going to be a new Syria. And I sure do hope that that will be true. But as we approach 2022, which will be basically passing the 10-year mark, it is becoming quite obvious that at least 8 to 10 million of the Syrians who were subject to exodus have no plans, neither do have opportunities to return. And we're talking about the second generation being born in asylum. So going back to the issue of who constitutes these unorthodox minorities, what is their stance since the establishment of nation states in the Middle East, what were their relations with ex-colonial powers or colonial powers, whether the kind of history and memory that pertains to their existence in the region. These are very important issues, and then there's one common denominator that marks all of their standing, which is what I call societal amnesio-dispossession. What I mean by that is true forced migration and legal dispossession of unorthodox minorities in the region. What follows is very common, and we see a reconstruction of the modern state and the erasure of both the site memory as well as official records of any of these internally and then international displaced populations for the future of the hosting nationalism and the national population. So it is almost as if they didn't exist. And that's why I use the title, "The Past is a Foreign Country." When members of the unorthodox minorities who are in exile, who are diaspora members, talk about histories of nationhood pertaining to the countries that they left, their memories do not match either with the official record histories of these nation states in the Middle East or with the current populations and new generation who at times do not even remember such populations existed, even within the neighborhood that they're living, or in the registers of national history, never mind universities, public service, and cultural achievements of these minorities. And land definitely changes hand. And often they're very commonly repeated strategies, such as building of public squares on graveyards, exchange of land and resources that belong to these minorities, through contracts being signed with transnational companies, so that what was once villages and fields might become the site for a new dam or hydration project, or extractive industries, or mining projects. And then therefore there's actually no physical trace of the houses and the villages, and then the schools and the churches and the prayer houses of these minorities that you can go back to. The registers, if it's not done through wartime in terms of burning of the records, are steadily removed from the National Archives. So if you were to go back 2-3 generations later and make a claim, even if not for property, but for nationalities purposes, there's no record of your family or your grandparents or your ancestry in the region, other than perhaps a piece of paper that you're holding in your hand. And I must say in earnest that I would argue 99% of these minorities who have been exiled and silenced and has been subject to forced migration entertain no prospect of return, either now or for their children. In fact, there's a lot of pressure on the next generation never to return to the region, because the fear is so deep, and it's so multi-generational in terms of traumas of dispossession experienced. Perhaps the only thing that's kept alive is linguistic and cultural identity, as well as religious practices. But the physical ties with the region, by all means, are prescribed to be cut by the diaspora population as far as the new generation is concerned. So I'm seeing a lot of comments on the chat. I'm sorry, while I'm talking, I cannot address them. Maybe I should stop for a moment and look at them. But Ken, how much time do I have?
I would say could give you another 5 minutes, Nergis, but we won't be doing the discussion until the end of the webinar and closer to the end. So don't worry about that.
Okay. So I'm just going to talk about some of the difficulties I run into doing this kind of work, because when you look at Middle Eastern studies, starting with Albert Hourani's traditional definition of minorities, and there's like an increasing literature now, but for years, almost 2 decades, when you looked at minorities in the Middle East, it was often referring to, let's say, if you're in a Muslim majority state, then you being Christian or Jewish identified you as a minority. So the ethnic definition of minority, by and large, has been non-existent or very dismal in the Middle Eastern context due to the Ottoman millet system heritage. Iran has been an exception. Iraq followed a different trait, and not in a good way, but in terms of dealing with its Kurdish population. Lebanon followed constitutional system, but by and large, the definition of traditional minorities in the Middle East, I would say, was very narrowly constructed. Let's say if you're a Copt in Egyptian context, sure enough, you're recognized. But if you belong to one of the Middle Eastern churches, let's say in Syria, this was not necessarily recognized as minority status. So there was like a very fluid attribution to the lifetimes and records and situation and treatment of especially various Arab Christian dominations, as well as Shiites and Alevis and Druze and Baha'i and certain in-between groups that belong neither here nor there. And the best example of that is, of course, Yazidis, who have been subject to various very disturbing atrocities in the last 10 years in the context of both the Syrian war, and before that in the context of the Iraqi insurgents and warfare there. So why would I choose those groups as my focus? I think a very important reason for that is the lack of recognition of their distinct characteristics as a community. which then makes it quite easy legally to dispose of them. But it also has to do with the fact that in so many ways, at least where I stand, these communities are representative of the hybrid and very complex nature of Middle Eastern identities themselves. The notion of purity in terms of the Middle Eastern nation state is a very dangerous one. It's as dangerous in the region as it is elsewhere. But when you are facing cascades and cascades of minority formation and intermarriages and communal interactions, and it's not just for Muslim majority countries in the Middle East, this also applies to Israel. There are very many problems concerning if you're a Mizrahim who speak Arabic, who have intermarriage in your family, as well as, let's say, Shias in Iraq, I mean, Sunnis in Lebanon, Palestinian Christians in Jordan. These kinds of metrics in terms of identity and denominational metrics makes it very, very difficult for you to be accepted as a legitimate political subject in the registers of the nation state, which then makes it quite real for you to be subjected to political marginalization, cultural vulnerability, socioeconomic precarity, and then eventually dispossession. And so what I'm looking at is trying to ascertain whether there's a repeated pattern across the nation state system in the region, not because Middle Easterners are worse than anybody else, but just like in the African context, there are certain trajectories about the treatment of tribal identities, whether these patterns of dispossession lead to resource creation for both the states and the nation, national bourgeoisie in the region, and whether the demographic redistribution, segregation of population engineering, large-scale transfers, exchange of property, they actually drastically reshape the composition of present-day Middle Eastern politics. So maybe I should stop here. I think I put a lot on the table, and then I'd love to relate to my co-presenters' ideas in terms of a final discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nergis, and as always, a kind of incredibly articulate discussion on the complexities of dispossession and the minority question in the Middle East. And if you haven't read any of Nergis's great scholarship in this area, I highly recommend to all participants that you put her materials on your reading list, because it really, really gets at the heart of how complex this situation is in terms of the movements of people, in terms of dispossession, in terms of identity, and the way that states interact with people. It really is incredibly good work, and I really thank you for the value and the what you've done in terms of scholarship, because it really has helped us to understand the area and its complexities in such an interesting and such a dynamic way. So thank you again, and thank you for being here for this webinar, because I know your time is very limited because you're such a busy person as well. Our second speaker today is Mr. Haval Hamad. Haval is an associate faculty at Royal Rose University. He's working in the Master of Human Security and Peacebuilding program. Haval is also a PhD candidate in international politics at Aberystwyth University in Wales. His work focuses on human security, countering violent extremism, and de-radicalization in particular. And in his current research projects, he's looking into the de-radicalization of children and youth in the post-ISIS era, while other projects include co-authoring research looking into human security in the de facto autonomous region of Rojava in northeast Syria. I should also mention that Haval and myself are co-authoring a book on de-radicalization, which is coming out hopefully later this year, when we can find time in our schedules to write the actual book. But we really look forward to adding something seriously interesting to the literature. But Haval has also, of course, been my student in the past, and in terms of I supervised his master's thesis, and probably in maybe the top 5 students that I ever had at Royal Roads. He might say the top 3, but I would probably say top 5. But I would like to welcome him. He's going to be talking on IDPs today and what's happening in that context. I think the title of his talk. Well, I'm actually going to leave this to Haval because he's more of an expert on this than I am. So I'd like to thank him for being here and thank you for making the presentation, Haval.
Thank you very much, Ken, for the intro, and thanks to my co-panelists for being part of today's webinar. And special thanks to all of those who have taken time to join us in today's discussion. Dr. Kanafi covered a lot of ground on the unorthodox minorities, great work, and this makes it more difficult for me to pick up from here. So thank you for that. In the next few minutes, I'll be focusing on the internally displaced persons within Syria, which moving forward, I will be referring to as IDPs. And this includes IDPs in camps and those who live in cities, towns, or villages. For those of you not familiar with the term IDP, United Nations guiding principle on internal displacement are persons or a groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of permanent residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. So in plain, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees defines IDP as those who have fled their homes for safety and have not crossed a border. So relating this to the definition of or the context of the Syrian refugees and displacement crisis, the IDP issue in Syria is one of the largest in modern history since World War II. In addition to the 5.6 million refugees outside of Syria, primarily Jordan and Turkey, the Syrian conflict, which erupted back in 2011, has resulted in over 6 million IDPs. To be exact, 6,495,000 IDPs as per the latest stats in mid-2020. New reports suggest the numbers are nearing to 7 million IDPs. Now, driven by the conflict, the Syrian regime's brutality, the regional powers agenda through the sponsorship of certain rebel factions, clashes have left Syrians desperate for safety. The complicity of the crisis and lack of intervention makes the IDP movement come with human security cost. Given the ongoing conflict, changes in conflict dynamics, the large number of IDPs and the number of camps, these human security challenges remain unaddressed. Even with the UNHCR's best practices, they remain unaddressed, simply due to logistics, corruption, cost, and continuous movement, where many IDPs have had to relocate twice or even 3 times in the last 10 years. However, if we are to center our emphasis on 2 causes or concerns that cause implications for the IDP's human security, there would be 1, the size and range of the IDP population, and 2, the ongoing intense conflict that includes multiple local, regional, and state actors in the Syrian conflict. To start with the first main obstacle, and that is the size and range of the IDP population, the massive number of 6+ million IDP makes it extremely challenging for local and international aid organizations to meet the needs. The size and range also comes with corruption among local authorities, the Syrian regime, rebel factions, and even through my interviews with locals, there were even accusations of corruption among international aid organization personnel as well. So to give you a perspective on the size and the range of IDP population, only in Aleppo and Idlib government, and since 2011, there have been 426 IDP camps with a total population of 617,000 IDP. Some of these makeshift camps housed as little as 250 people, which makes about 43 families, and as many as 21,000 individuals, which makes an average of 4,000 families. In other parts of Syria and other cities in the northeast, in Hol Camp specifically, which I believe Sasha will be talking about more next, among this almost 70,000 inhabitants in Hol Camp, over 27,000 of those are Syrian IDPs, beside the Iraqi and other foreign nationals, those who are affiliated with ISIS. A small number of the Syrians in that camp, in Hol Camp, have been reunited in the last year with their families and their what's being referred to as a tribal sponsorship, because these individuals were being held in Hol Camp for their affiliation and association with ISIS. So if you're adding up the numbers and say that doesn't add up to 6 million, you're absolutely right, because those are only those in camps. The rest have relocated and continue to relocate as we speak, as competing political and military players win and lose ground. It even becomes more difficult to coordinate the existing limited resources, because these camps and areas are under the control of different groups. Some of these camps are under the control of the Syrian regime, others are under the control of different rebel factions, while others are under the control of the Kurds in the autonomous administration region in northeast Syria. All of those are competing entities in the Syrian conflict. And coordinating humanitarian aid and implementing human security measures is almost impossible, as you can imagine. You can imagine, in fact, the certain rebel factions backed by Turkey, and Turkey itself as a neighboring state, control their side of the border crossing and crossing of goods and aids to limit or to prevent humanitarian aid entering regions not under their control, like the Kurdish-controlled region. On the other hand, the Assad regime controls international aid and funnels it to only to regime-controlled areas. What exacerbates this manipulation of international aid to IDPs in Syria is the very same intergovernmental agency, the UN, because the UNHCR charter dictates that the UN deals with internationally recognized bodies. So even though the UN acknowledges the atrocities committed by the Assad regime, the regime is still recognized internationally as a representative, and I'm using quotation mark here, a representative of the Syrian people, and therefore receives aid on behalf of the Syrian people. On both other sides of the border, Jordan and Turkey, they also receive aid. However, Jordan receives aid specifically for the refugee camp in Jordan, and primarily that's Al-Zatri refugee camp, where Turkey also receives aid for refugees in Turkey, where they are hosting the largest number of Syrian refugees, but also for areas under the control of Turkish-backed factions in northeastern Syria. So, as you can imagine, when aid is being manipulated and politicized by regional powers, the limitation or I should say the impact of aid becomes more of a
You're muted, Tabal. Can you unmute?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's good.
Okay, I don't know where it stopped hearing me. I'll just go back a couple points here. I was talking about on both other sides of the border where Jordan and Turkey receive aid as well, where Jordan receives aid primarily for the refugees in camps in Jordan, and Turkey receives and manages aid in both camps in Turkey, within Turkey, and also areas controlled by Turkish-backed factions of the Syrian opposition along the Syrian-Turkish border within Syria. For example, in the Kurdish city of Afrin and Sarikaniye after the Turkish incursion. So other players not supported by internationally recognized bodies or states are left scrambling for resources, especially with the closure of border crossing points. To make matters even worse, in mid-2020, the UN Security Council discussed a resolution, and that's resolution S2020/667, put forward by Belgium and Germany to extend the authorization mechanism for aid by keeping all border crossings in Syria open. It received 13 votes in favor, but was also voted by Russia and China. The United Nations Security Council failed to adopt or to adopt a resolution to exclude cross-border mechanisms for humanitarian aid to get to all parts of Syria through all crossing points of entry. This includes two separate resolutions to bring life-saving humanitarian assistance. To represent the politicization of aid, even on the international level, the two border crossing point of entry, which were excluded and ordered to remain closed as a result of the veto by Russia and China, were Al Yaroubiya crossing point, which is under the Kurdish control in northeast Syria, and it is on the border of Iraq, and Al Ramtha border crossing point on the Jordanian border. The opening of the one on the Jordanian border goes against the Russian interest and their support of the Assad regime, as this would have aided Syrian opposition factions, where the opening of the other crossing point on the Iraqi border would have aided the Kurds and other minorities in northeast Syria, including those in IDP camps. However, this too would have created a political and logistical problem for Turkey, because it would have impacted Turkish geopolitical aspiration of control of northeast Syria, especially given Erdogan's position from the Kurds. So as you can imagine, aid for IDPs become a negotiation card among state players in the Syrian conflict, and has furthermore become a tool in the proxy war. This brings me to point number 2, or the second major cause of human security implications, and that is the ongoing intense conflict that includes multiple local and state actors. The Syrian conflict entered its 10th year, and the conflict is getting intensified year after year because of the increase of state and non-state actors' involvement in the war. Examples of local actors include Muslim Brotherhoods, the Islamic Front, the Local Coordination Assembly, Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, the Assad regime, and the National Coalition, Al-Nusra Front, Jabhat Tahrir al-Sham, and ISIS. Non-state regional actors include Hezbollah, the Iraqi Shia militias, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. State actors include Turkey, Russia, and the US as part of the international coalition. The shift in the power dynamic between these competing players deprives locals of what I can refer to as medium-term peace. I'm not even going to suggest what we call in the human security field as sustainable peace, but rather medium-term peace. This also forces existing IDPs to relocate out of fear when a new competing force takes control of the area, simply because of the increase of what we can call in the betrayal culture, where one group is perceived as a traitor for staying under the protection of a different group, or will simply be perceived as collaborators and therefore will be subject to imprisonment, torture, or killing. Under these circumstances, the human security of IDPs in Syria is facing new challenges under ongoing political, cultural, economic, and social changes. So how do we mitigate the impact of human insecurity and create opportunities for IDPs' human security to work? Human security's key principle is safeguarding individuals' vital freedoms by protecting them from critical and prevalent threats and providing them with opportunities to control their lives. Now, For this to work, ideally, a ceasefire needs to occur and the conflicts need to end. However, realistically speaking, in the short term and given the scale of the conflict and the number of active players in the Syrian conflict, this is not going to happen anytime soon. But what can pave the way to give peace a chance and provide IDPs with human security can be summarized in a number of recommendations or bullet points, and I will conclude my discussion with these recommendations. One, a UN Security Council resolution to open all border crossing points to facilitate aid transportation and distribution. Two, limiting the Turkish military involvement and support of radical extremist groups of the factions of the Syrian opposition, which are committing systematic ethnic cleansing through forced displacement, for example, in the cities of Afrin and Sreikaniye. Limiting the Russian role within all regime-controlled areas. Transferring camps administration to UNHCR. 5, creating a no-fly zone. We saw that really helped in the Iraqi conflict in the 90s, where the UN imposed a no-fly zone in northern Iraq. And 6, international recognition for the self-administration in northeast Syria, because once they have international recognition, then intergovernmental agency would be able to facilitate and work with the administration to facilitate aid. Those are few, but the list goes on, of course. I think I'm approaching my time here, but I want to add that sustainable peace starts by addressing aid mechanisms. Without aid, peace building cannot be achieved in Syria due to the laws, what I can refer to due to the laws of the Syrian identity in the last 10 years. Unfortunately, in the last 10 years, the Syrian identity has been associated with regional and ideological players involved in the conflict. That's my time, everyone. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any question you might have if you type them in the Q&A chat box or in the general chat box, and then Ken will be reading those questions at the end of the webinar. Ken?
Thanks so much, Haval, for, again, a very articulate and succinct expression of what's happening in the region, and especially amongst the sort of power plays from different regional actors, from state actors and from non-state actors in stoking how these conflicts work out and the repercussions from these conflicts, which are, of course, atrocities and always affect the civilians on the ground, the people on the ground, and leave us with real human security dilemmas. What do we do in these cases? And I think that you've also gone some way to try and answer these questions, and that's so important. So thanks for taking that on and working with that. Our third speaker today is Mr. Sasha Hoffman. Sasha is a graduate of International Relations from Simon Fraser University here in Vancouver. He currently works as a researcher and spokesperson with the Rojava Information Center, the lead news and research center in North and East Syria. And the Information Center works with all the world's top news organizations to help them report out on the situation in Northeast Syria. So this is, again, incredibly important work, incredibly important journalism, and providing the facts on the ground as to what's actually going on. They also produce in-depth reports based on original on-the-ground research. And for the last 2 years, the center has reported on the fate of internally displaced peoples in the various regions of North and East Syria. So, Sasha, thank you for joining us. I know you're coming all the way in from Northeast Syria, and I'm hoping that your connections are good. And I know that you're going to give us a fascinating talk on what's happening there on the ground and an up-to-date analysis of how things are. So again, can't give you enough thanks for coming in today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, for sure. Yeah, as you said, I'm coming to you live from on the ground, and I hope we can keep the connection stable. I'll try my best. make this work. So I will talk a little bit about IDPs in North and East Syria, the ones that are under the protection of the autonomous administration here. There will be some overlap with Habal's presentation, but I hope we can maybe localize the issues a bit more. And there goes the power. I hope the internet is still connected. So basically what you're seeing now on your screens is an updated map of all the IDP camps in North and East Syria, with the 2 evacuated camps at Ain Issa and Mabruka. Overall, the Shehba region, which is the region just south of Afrin in the west, hosts five camps, 2 more in Manbij, and overall there's another 10 in North and East Syria, with 6 of them being actually recognized by the UN, the other ones being more of unofficial or ad hoc camps, and 1 more camp being built near Deir ez-Zor. So overall, this region hosts over 1 million IDPs, but the camps themselves only have 125,000, roughly 125,000 IDPs, which means obviously that most IDPs are not in these camps, as Habal mentioned already. So I think the background to the Syrian civil war has been mentioned a little bit. I will give more context to the 2 recent Turkish invasions. The first one being the Operation Olive Branch, the invasion of Afrin. Afrin was, before the invasion, actually quite a stable and peaceful region, and was host to a lot of other IDPs from all parts of Syria, Kurds and Arabs. With the invasion, 300,000 people were displaced. That some people say up to 80% of the population had to leave. And this turned the region from one that was around 92% Kurdish to one that is now 70% or 75% Turkmen and Arab. And as Habal has mentioned, this together with these plans of building a Turkmen belt on the Turkish border, they amount to a campaign of ethnic cleansing by Turkey. The IDPs, the local population that had to flee, are also prevented from going back by kidnappings, killings, theft of property, occupation, etc. Around more than half of the 300,000 that fled Afrin went actually to this small part south of Afrin called Shehba. Okay, here we're back. But only around 7,000 or 7,500 actually went into the camps, which means, obviously 150,000 people had to find settlement elsewhere. The camps themselves are administered by the administration of North and East Syria and the Kurdish Red Crescent to 95%, with only 5% being covered by the UN and the Syrian Red Crescent. The second invasion that should serve as our context here is Operation Peace Springs. This was more than a year later in 2019. The narrative that was pushed by Turkey for this invasion was the creation of a safe zone for IDPs. Of course, this doesn't take into account that already around 700,000 IDPs were living in North and East Syria at this time. And again, this is it plays into Turkey's project of displacing Kurds from the regions that they inhabited. And now around 30% of the Arab population has actually gone back to this region that is occupied by Turkey between Gerispi and Sarakaniye. and 10% of the Kurdish population has gone back. The numbers that the UN has reported, some as high as 130,000, are based on Turkish data and should not be taken seriously. In fact, only around a few hundred or thousand people have gone back to this area. If we can go to the next slide, we can see a breakdown of the IDP population. You can see here that most IDPs are not in camps. They're not even in informal settlements. They're so-called hidden IDPs. We will talk later on about Hol Camp, which is a kind of a focal point for international media. This is the region here in bright red. But as you can see, overall, it's not the majority of IDPs that live there, even though it is the largest camp here in North and East Syria. Another thing that is important to note is that most of these IDPs, sometimes as high as 75%, are women and children, and that children are also the most affected, with somewhere around 86,000 children being deprived of an education because of the 2019 invasion. One more thing to mention, we can go to the next slide. Sorry, one more slide. So another thing to mention is that the 2019 attack also led, as I said, to 2 camps being evacuated, and a lot of ISIS members escaping from the camps, which further destabilized the region. Okay, we can go back one slide. Sorry about that. So as you see here, this is Hol Camp in 2017, and as I speak, you'll see it growing and growing. Hol Camp is the largest camp here in North and East Syria. Around 65,000 people live in the camp, with 9,000 foreigners being housed in the annex in the southeast that you see being built right now. The management for this camp comes from the Bluemont Group. This is a US NGO. There's around 7 NGOs that do various things from supplies to health services. This is a mix of international and local groups, but in fact, most of the work is done by local groups that are actually on the ground. There are around 14 health facilities in this camp, which are run by the Kurdish Red Crescent and Doctors Without Borders. But again, most of the aid actually comes from the administration, the autonomous administration of North and East Syria. The camp has 3 out of the 40 ventilators that North and East Syria as in total has. This might not sound like much, but it's actually a lot better than many other camps that exist. Overall, the situation in Hol Camp, as bad as it sometimes is not as bad as many other camps. There is, though, security issues in these camps. As some of you might have heard, there was an assassination of a staffer from Doctors Without Borders roughly 1 week ago, and a major fire as well. So yeah, security continues to be fragile at best. Again, there is IDP life. Most IDPs are outside of these camps, outside of Hol Camp, as much as the media might like to focus on this camp. There is special conditions to people outside of these camps, people, for example, staying in cities, which is where most IDPs actually live, are for one tied to the local economy more than people in the camps. On the other hand, they're also vulnerable, for example, to Turkish attacks as well that happened to villages around Heseke and Tel Tamer, close to the part that was invaded by Turkey in 2019. If we can go to the next slide, or two over. Yeah, there we go. So silver lining to the IDP situation is that in certain parts, like this in Sheba camp, again, Sheba being just south of Afrin, hosting mostly people who fled Afrin after the invasion. A few positive notes is that here the political system of the local government or the autonomous administration has been implemented better than in other parts. So, for example, here you can see the tents housing the council of the camp. There's been a commune established here. This has given IDPs more control over their life, as was mentioned before. There's been communal gardens, better education for children, training in local governance, and also women's houses that have been built. But for the most part, the situation of IDPs is still precarious. So, for example, what we have heard mostly is one, as was mentioned before, that the closing of the Yarubia crossing has been detrimental. This was done, as was said before, because of a veto by Russia. People have pointed out that while this crossing, this aid crossing, which was the sole aid crossing directly to North and East Syria, has been closed, there is still 2 border crossings connected to Turkey that remain open. Again, what has been said before is that a lot of the international aid that is coming, that is meant for North and East Syria, has to pass through Damascus, and often gets stuck in bureaucracy or graft. And we've heard numbers as high as 50% of the value of these things passing through being taxed by local authorities. A lot of these camps are also, as was mentioned, being left to be administered by the autonomous administration. It kind of mirrors the way that it's been left to deal with repatriation or trial of ISIS members, but this is, symptomatic of a larger malaise. What we've heard is that these camps mostly lack a shortage of medical kits, of medicine, as well as agriculture products. But larger than that, in general, IDPs, the biggest shortcomings that they mention is in health and psychological health, especially. There's been outbreaks of tuberculosis as well in camps, and corona, of course, is always an issue as well. A lot of people in camps have also complained about not being able to connect to local economies, which again is why people in cities sometimes have it easier. One last issue as well is the weather, the climate conditions, which in winter can get pretty bad. Overall, the issues that we've meant here, that we've mentioned, that people have mentioned, are mostly like short-term issues. The larger issues being, of course, the occupation. So what a lot of people have said that you know, sending aid is good, is needed, but the international community should really focus on ending the occupation so people can actually go back. And adding to that, of course, is also the UN resolution to reopen the Yarubia border. That was it for me.
Okay, thank you so much, Sasha, for that analysis. And it's great to get that kind of local analysis right on the ground there, and the research you've done is absolutely amazing. You know, I was just watching the precarious situation of journalists reporting on these conflicts, and in particular, one documentary which I recommend to everyone if they can watch it on ISIS in Raqqa, called City of Ghosts, which is I think it's on Amazon Prime or Netflix. But it's very, very powerful documentary showing the kind of work that people do to get these facts out, and putting their life in danger, etc., to get the statistics, the facts, what's actually happening there right on the ground. So your work is incredible, and to get that analysis is really unique. And we've gone from a sort of big sort of theoretical frameworks and discussions of how things work to what the regional actors and intrastate actors are doing, to right on the ground, to right on the sort of micro level of the camps today. And I think that's absolutely amazing. What I'd like to do now is open it up to discussion. I have a few questions that have been coming in because it's great to have. And one of the best things about the webinars I found is the discussions coming in from outside, from our audience, from our participants, who've you know, also extremely interested in their own in some of the issues that everyone is raising. I have a question from. I'll start off with a question from Karen Godbout. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Karen. And she wants to ask Dr. Kanefi about the diaspora of the Iranian Baha'is in current scholarship and what's happening with them. And I think you have already answered part of this question by providing amazing sort of literature right up on the screen already. Nergis, so we just pop that up. That's amazing. But maybe you'd like to elaborate a little bit on it.
Yeah, I mean, very, very briefly, the Baha'i story is distinct in the sense that this is a millennial faith group that emerged turn of century, and the original followers were less than 500,000 in Iran. Estimated numbers are 350,000. But then today we know that the follower group, at least by the group's own estimates, grew up to 5 to 7 million. And there are sizable communities in Egypt, Yemen, and Afghanistan, as well as a very noticeable diaspora community in North America. But you asked only about the Baha'i community in Iran, so I'm just going to give a nutshell assessment of the kinds of problems that they've been facing with. They are denied national identity cards, which means they cannot register for voting, they cannot even get driving license, they can be expelled from schools, they certainly cannot apply for public service, and they are in general treated with great suspicion by the state. The reason being, the faith itself announces the arrival of a new prophet, which is against the doctrine of Muhammad being the last prophet ever for the Abrahamic religions, right? So, and then, I mean, in so many words, their existence in Iran, in the Middle East, is marked by persecution. But what's interesting in their case is Baha'i, like the Alevis in Turkey, underline universal nature of man, gender equity, universal education, and in so many ways, they are very much one of those equity measures, kind of built-in equity measures, sort of newer faiths. And they flourished remarkably in North America. And their youth are organizing diaspora communities. And so some argue they have a missionary stance. No, they're not trying to convert people, but they're open to conversions, and they don't even call it conversions. They welcome other members, and then they take a stance in cultural politics, let's say in the Canadian context. So which is very interesting, because when you look at the Iranian profile, it's all about exclusion, persecution, violence. But when they come to diaspora, it's almost like they find their true profile. And then it's no longer just persecution, but a different kind of world vision. I'm not a Baha'i myself, so if I'm speaking in flowery language, it's not a personal choice, but that is the truth of what happens when you take some of these communities out. And by the way, many of the others do not have such happy stories, such as the Chaldean and Yaqubi Middle Eastern Christians. Even the Holy Book, they use the language of Aramaic, which is the language, I believe, Jesus Christ himself spoke. So their holy books are even taken out of Iraq and Syria, and then their churches are reestablished here. But their existence is marked with deep sorrow and the inability to even go back to their the houses of prayer, and the community itself has seen very murderous instances of cleansing. So unlike the Baha'i community, which is more hopeful, happier in the sense in the diaspora, these other communities are really struggling with absorbing the recent memory of what has happened to them and still is happening to them. So I hope it answers. And I mean, I did not realize that the emphasis will be more on the current Syrian situation. I could have talked about that more. So I'm sorry if there has been a bit of a too large an expanse when I opened up the discussion, but I hope it benefits in the long run.
Thanks so much, Nergis, for that very concise answer. And we do have a question again for Haval. And the question is concerning anyone other than the Assad regime's factions are giving protection to the Syrian Christians, which comes from Tony. And
I think that
he has. So let me just follow that up, because I'm just getting this on the Google account now. Tony's understanding is that the Assad regime factions were the only one that made the point to extend the protection to the small Christian enclaves. How accurate is this information?
It's a very good question, Tony. Thank you for bringing it up. And the fact is, the Assad regime throughout the last few decades, since the mid-70s, even during the Assad father's regime, have always used Christians as a card to present themselves as a savior of minorities in Syria, and also to appeal to the West. In reality, minorities, including Christians, and even the Sunni majority in Syria, have always been subjected to atrocities, exclusion, and restrictions on their religious and political freedoms. And since the 70s, as I mentioned, these groups have barely been represented in the political life in Syria, including the Christians. And when the representation happened or takes place on the political life, it's usually a loyalist to the regime. And they are carefully selected by the regime to serve the regime's agenda, and not those agenda or the interests of the people they are supposedly are representing. So there are extremely limited opportunities for political and religious freedoms in Syria, especially when it comes to Christians. In plain, the regime is using the Christians as a political card to shrine its image to the West. That is generally speaking. In terms of other parts of Syria, and given the short lived experience of the self-administration in northeast Syria, which is under the control of the Kurds, I can clearly see that Christians are very well represented in the political and military processes of northeast Syria. And you can refer to, for example, the Syriac Military Council. We could see they're equally represented beside the Arab and the Kurds and Turkmen and the Yazidis and other minorities in the political and the military representation of the SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, and generally the political structure and the administration of northeast Syria as well. I hope that answers the question, and I'm sure Sasha, being there, he can speak more to that as well at this time.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I concur with what Hol said. There is that link, that historical link between the Assad regime and Christians, especially Armenians in Syria. But from where I'm seeing it, this has mostly to do with the history, and not necessarily what is happening right now. And so, for example, here in Kamishlo, where I'm connected from, there's a considerable minority of Christians living here who are actually split between supporting the al-Assad government and the autonomous administration. And again, as Hol said, there has been a considerable effort to include Christians in the administration, and not just as individuals, but also as a religious group, and to grant them that freedom.
Thanks so much, Hol and Sasha, for those answers. I do have another question for Nergis, and the question is concerning the treatment of the Sunnis in Lebanon. I think this is from Tony. He's asking, are they underprivileged, the Sunnis in Lebanon? He was unsure whether you had made that comment. So we're trying to get some clarification on that, the position of Sunnis in Lebanon, the minority.
I mean, this is a very complex issue, and I'll only answer it circumventionally, in the sense that when Syrian refugees arrived in Lebanon, one of the reasons why they could not be given permanent status or naturalized is that, as you do know, the Lebanese politics, at least traditionally, was characterized as consociational. So you've got the Lebanese Christians, the Shia Lebanese, and the Sunni Lebanese. And with the introduction of Palestinian populations into the demographics of the Lebanese population, that balance really changed. And so there was a great concern, both by Shia Lebanese and Christian Lebanese, that if Syrians were accepted, and that caveat, by the way, applies to Sunni Iraqis who left Iraq after the Allied invasion and then in the regime change, then the balance would tip. Some argue that the Shia Lebanese have the short end of the stick. Others argue that the Sunni Lebanese never got what they deserved. There's a common perception that the Christian Lebanese are the ones who always receive the best. Yet others argue that, within the greater Syria project, Sunni Lebanese cannot be trusted. That's why I'm saying I cannot give like a straightforward answer, because there is no straightforward answer. This is really contextual. But suffice to say that if there's an increase in Sunni Lebanese population, and then the rest of the population tends to be very perturbed by the possibility.
Okay, many thanks, Nergis, for that question. I do another question from Nibigira Jean Berchmas. Although he's sending this to everyone, I think he's asking the experts on the panel. He's a very different type of question. It does concern where he comes from in Africa. He's trying to get people to try and understand what the problem is here. He says, I am from the minority Tutsi of Rwanda. I was born in Uganda, camp refugee. While returned to Rwanda, and my entire family was murdered and fled to Burundi during the mass killing in Burundi. No one recognizes me as Rwandan and Uganda can't issue me an identity. He's saying, who am I? Which I think is almost an impossible question for anyone on the panel to answer. But given the fact that refugees, migrants have these tremendous, I should say, intersectionality of identities, complexity of the dispossessed. If anyone wants to take on that question, perhaps Nergis. I don't like to impose that upon you, but I know you've been studying this stuff for most of your life, and it is the whole identity issue. I mean, it's just incredibly complex, especially when people are in such a fluid, moving situation. Of course, we have the added complication, not the added complication, but the horrific kind of context of the atrocities that took place in Rwanda and across spilling into Burundi and all these other countries in Africa.
I mean, the immediate response I will give to Nibigira is you're a very precious human being. And that story is really very reflective of contemporary realities in many of the region states. And I mean, I'm just following your disposition here. Tutsi of Rwanda, born in Uganda in a refugee camp, and therefore you couldn't have had an ID. But because you were a Tutsi of Rwanda, at the time Rwanda would not have recognized you. Then the family moves from Uganda to Rwanda and gets murdered during the genocide, I believe. And then you fled to Burundi. So you were born in Uganda, went to Rwanda, ran away to Burundi, but there was a mass killing in Burundi that followed the Rwandan genocide, so you flew to Kenya. Now the problem is there's already a problem between Kenya and Uganda, right? So like there isn't just a problem between Burundi and Rwanda, but there's also a problem between Kenya and Uganda. And then therefore, none of the four locations would actually benefit from declaring you as their citizen, because in each case, you're either a refugee or you're a minority that is not wanted, right? So, I mean, under UNHCR definition, you're stateless. And therefore you would be afforded some degree of international protection. Now, I'm not I cannot act in the capacity of a lawyer, but you are who you think you are in that sense, in terms of cultural identity, ethnic identity, and you identify yourself as a Tutsi of Rwanda, and that's why you are. It doesn't matter who gives you what kind of identity card. And eventually, I don't know where you are right now, but if you're in diaspora, ask yourself, how would you raise your child? And that will be the determinant of who you feel you are. But in terms of status, you are stateless as far as I can see.
Thanks, Nergis. Such a great answer to the complexity of that question, and such a tragic situation which defines many refugees and migrants all over the world, not just in the Middle East and North Africa, of course, but in Africa we have this tremendously complex situation of people moving across borders, people suffering from atrocities, and all of the identity, and also, as you mentioned before, tribal identities mixed in with that, etc. One thing I would say is that we have a great resource in Kampala in Uganda, in Makerere University, which hosts the refugee law project. And if you need material from that, that would be one place to look at. And I'm sure that they are also doing a lot of work on trying to provide solutions also to that. And I know that Nergus and we always had connections with the Oxford University and their refugee studies program from many years ago, and lots of great resources there on how we can address these issues and how we can work through some of these issues. But I think that's about it for questions.
If we jump in as well to
yes, about yeah.
Sorry about that. Nipina, unfortunately, you are one of millions of refugees who are facing this identity issue, and I don't think there's an expert in the world better than you yourself to answer this very question when it comes to you. And the reason why I'm saying this is I'm a big believer of Henry Tatchell's social identity theory, where you should be in position to associate yourself to whatever social group you feel close to. Identity simply is not an ID card or a passport where you can associate yourself with, but rather is a sense of belonging. And whatever group you associate yourself with, you feel belong to, whether they're Rwandan or Kenyan, that is your identity. And I think I will add to what Nerga said as well. Think of the question of how you want to raise your own children, for example, or how you want to, what kind of an impact would you want to have in your communities, and where that impacts come from which social group, and that is your identity. I can't just emphasize enough, but definitely no expert in the world can answer that question better than you. And unfortunately, you're one of millions.
And you're muted.
Sorry, it's a terribly complex situation, as Nergus and Haval have pointed out. And all I would say is take this advice. It's great advice, and the answers are very powerful. I do think we have run out of questions. I'm not sure if we've run out of time. I think we were scheduled for an hour and a half. Is that right, Selena? Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is, I think I'd like to finish off by just going around the three panelists and asking them for a few words on how we think we should proceed in a very practical sense to either mitigating these conflicts in terms of migration and refugees, or trying to resolve them. These are huge questions. But if you had one or two items on your wish list, your humanitarian wish list for the region that would help people, that would provide them with kind of human security and would provide a platform for enabling them to live their lives in a normal way, what would that be? I'll start off with our eminent professor from University of Toronto, Nergus. A very difficult question.
No. I want to hear what our younger colleagues want to say first.
Okay.
So I don't know, either Sasha or Haval.
Yeah, let's start off with Sasha.
Right. Yeah, as you mentioned, my presentation was a bit more, based on facts on the ground, and I could really only speak about North and East Syria in this regard. But if I'm going to draw any larger conclusions away from the very obvious, stopping the occupation, stopping the war, I would say that what really makes a difference is for the people that are right now stuck in these camps, to be economically independent, to be politically self-organized. So what we saw in some of these camps, as I've highlighted, especially in the Sheba camps, was that overall the situation in the camps that had some form of political administration was a lot better than in the others.
Okay, great, thank you. Val?
I'm muted, perfect, yeah. I think I'll start with limiting unauthorized regional interference in any conflict, in any regional conflict around the world. The increase in regional interference causes more instability and therefore causes IDPs to relocate. Ideally, we would want to see IDPs to relocate to one camp and receive the support and aid needed until peace is achieved. However, with multiple players interfering in any conflict, it does increase the chances for IDPs to relocate, and the relocation process puts them at more risk. The other point is addressing corruption within the aid sector. Unfortunately, corruption is a topic that comes a lot when you interview people from conflict zones and refugee camps. And as I mentioned during my presentation, corruption is not only at the regional level, but also at the international level when it comes to international aid organizations personnel. Also the point that a large sum of aid or dedicated aid or donated aid is usually spent on administrative duties, rent, car rentals for staff, reports, administrative duties, where a smaller portion of that is spent on the actual programming in refugee camps or IDP camps. And the last point is more accountability when it comes to funneling or channeling fund to neighboring countries. It seems like the refugee crisis around the world has become a business to an extent, to some sort of regional powers, whether we're looking at North Africa or the Middle East, where regional powers would use refugees as a political card to gain some other political points from their opponents. And one of the conditions will usually be, for example, is to put a condition to the UNHCR is that, for example, Jordan dictated that they should be receiving all the donation coming from the Canadian government and the UN generally and any other foreign government to the Syrian refugees, and they should administrate and run and distribute the fund to the Syrian refugees. There are a lot of reports about corruptions, and that one specific charity, which is linked to the royal family, was assigned to receive all the funds and distribute it to the different agencies and manage programming with refugee camps. But if you go to this refugee camp, for example, a Zaatari camp, the situation is appalling, and it's beyond what you can imagine as a human being. Which speaks volume to how much money is actually being spent on all these refugees and how much is going to the pockets of those who are in power. Also, politicizing the issue of refugees is another big concern here. For example, we've seen with the Turkish regime utilizing or politicizing the issue of refugees against their argument with the European Union and threatening the EU, for example, to open the border to millions of Syrian refugees to go to EU if they don't get X and Y. We need to humanize the refugee crisis. We need to humanize refugees. We need to humanize IDPs, and that's a good start point. If we use them as a political card, if we use them as a piggy bank to get money from international donors, then we're really contributing to their human insecurity.
Thanks so much, Val. And Nergis, I'm going to leave the final word to you, as always. And I just wish we'd had some of your paintings in the background. That would have been a lovely, lovely way, because your paintings are such articulate expressions of some of these crises, and not only the pain but the imagery. It's so powerful in terms of getting at some of the dilemmas that are going on, and that's when that sort of art becomes, historical and political and shows us something that's very powerful. But I'll leave you the last few words and then finish up.
I really appreciate you. Won my heart yet again. So But I just want to say that I have to speak from a position of pessimism of the mind and optimism of the soul, in the sense that I don't see the states in the region changing their way of doing things in terms of expulsions and dispossessions. I think that will continue until and unless there's some perceived merit in terms of incorporating these minorities into the national polity. And that's an internal problem as much as an external problem. What I'm going to say in terms of optimism, though, as I gave the Baha'i example, the notion of diaspora is very important. There are transnational identities emerging, and that allows us to remember those histories despite all the measures taken for their eradication. So these communities and these individual stories, and I'm going to go back to Nibigira's story, he is among us. He's alive. He has agency, he has a voice, and he tells the story to us. And then I mean, just by sheer fact of being able to articulate what's going on in the region, just in that little paragraph that he wrote, I mean, it is so succinct and so powerful. And in terms of, this is something I'm working on, Ken knows, our responsibility as scholars and as advocates is to reveal, to witness, to document, and then to bring attention to these issues, so that it's not just something that happens in that far away region to somebody else, right? So that's all I can say.
Okay, many thanks, Nergis. Many thanks, Val. Many thanks, Sasha, for being here today and offering these incredible insights into the diverse and incredibly complex world of what's happening with refugees, migration, conflict within the Middle East and North Africa. I think we're going to end this session here. I know it's been recorded so people can go back. But again, I'd just like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank Selena and Karen for hosting also and for organizing much of this. This is the third and the final in the series for this year in the webinars in terms of what we've been doing in the Middle East and North Africa. But we will be back next year with hopefully some more really incredible and interesting topics. We are going to have another webinar on the 18th of March from the Human Security and Peacebuilding Program. I'm going to be having an armchair conversation, which I thought would be interesting with Dr. Lauren Oates. Dr. Oates is a sort of humanitarian superstar who started up a Canadian NGO for young women and girls in Afghanistan and has been the subject of many TED Talks, etc. So if you're around on the 18th of March, please sign up for that. And that should be a lot of fun, but also fascinating insight into how humanitarian practitioners work in the field, because that's her main focus. And with that in line, a very big thank you to everyone, and I hope you have a fantastic day. I hope, Sasha, that you're staying safe in northeast Syria. I hope, yes, Nergis, you're staying safe in Toronto. Everyone has to stay safe and well, because we're all under the COVID regime, regardless of where we are nowadays. And hopefully we're starting to see some light at the tunnel. But thanks for your optimism, and thanks for your powerful statements. And let's hope that things will improve in terms of human security for all of these refugees and migrants very soon, and for all of us all over from the COVID sense of insecurity. But thank you everyone. Great to see you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.